During my husband's funeral, my son leaned toward the pastor and whispered, "Don't mention my mother's name." I was sitting 6 feet away in the front pew, wearing the black dress Arthur had bought me for our 40th wedding anniversary, close enough to hear every word and old enough to understand exactly what silence can do to a woman. The church was full of white lilies, polished wood, soft organ music, and people speaking in low voices as if kindness could be measured by volume. Sunlight came through the stained glass windows in pale blue and gold, falling across Arthur's casket like something holy. I had imagined this day 100 different ways during his last year, when his hands grew thinner and his voice became softer. But I never imagined that the child I had raised would try to remove me from the final story of my own husband's life. Mark stood beside Pastor William Harris near the small side table where the printed funeral programs were stacked in neat rows. My son's navy suit looked expensive, his silver tie perfectly straight, his face arranged into the practiced sadness of a man who knew everyone was watching him. Vanessa stood beside him in a black coat with pearl buttons, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her blonde hair pinned back like she had stepped out of a magazine about graceful mourning. She did not look at me. She rarely did when she was getting exactly what she wanted. Pastor Harris glanced toward me after Mark spoke, and for one brief second, his eyes met mine. There was apology there. There was discomfort. But there was also obedience. He looked down at his notes and nodded. That little nod hurt more than I expected. It was not loud. It did not interrupt the service. No one gasped. No one turned around. Yet it moved through me like cold water, settling in my chest, my hands, my knees. I folded my fingers over the small black purse in my lap and sat very still. Arthur had always loved that about me, the way I could stay calm when everyone else hurried to fill a room with noise. "Helen," he used to say, "you don't have to raise your voice to be heard." I wondered if he could see me now, sitting in the first row of the First Methodist Church of Fairview, Ohio, while our only son instructed a pastor to speak of Arthur's life without speaking of the woman who had shared 44 years of it. I looked down at the funeral program I had been handed at the door. Arthur Caldwell was printed across the front in elegant gray letters, with the dates of his birth and passing beneath. Inside, there were 3 photographs. Arthur holding Mark as a toddler, Arthur standing beside Mark at his college graduation, and Arthur with Mark and Vanessa at their lake house last 4th of July. There was no wedding photograph. No picture from the Christmas morning when Arthur and I bought our first home. No mention of the small appliance store we had built together from a borrowed desk, 2 shelves, and a second-hand cash register. Near the bottom, in a line so small I almost missed it, the program read, "Survived by his son, Mark Caldwell, and family." And family. That was what I had become after 44 years of marriage. Not wife. Not partner. Not the woman who had slept in a hospital recliner for 9 straight nights when Arthur's breathing frightened me. Just family, tucked behind a comma, as if I were some distant cousin who had driven in from out of town. Vanessa turned then, only slightly, just enough for me to see the corner of her mouth soften into something that was not quite a smile. Mark kept his eyes forward. The organ music faded. Pastor Harris stepped to the pulpit, cleared his throat, and began to speak about Arthur's kindness, Arthur's work ethic, Arthur's love for his son. I listened to every word. I did not cry. I had done my crying in the quiet hours, in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, beside Arthur's empty chair, while the refrigerator hummed, and the whole house seemed too large for one heartbeat. This was different. This was not grief. This was erasure. And as I sat there beneath the stained glass, with my name missing from my husband's farewell, I understood that Mark and Vanessa were not simply managing a funeral. They were arranging the first public version of a future where I no longer mattered. They thought I would be too broken to notice. They thought a widow in a black dress would lower her head and accept whatever place they left for her. I smoothed the edge of Arthur's old handkerchief inside my purse and kept my eyes on the pulpit. I had spent most of my life protecting the peace of my family. But peace built on humiliation is not peace. It is a cage with flowers around the door. By the time Pastor Harris finished his opening prayer without saying my name once, something inside me had gone very quiet. Not empty, not weak. Quiet in the way a house becomes quiet right before a storm crosses the county line. The first part of the service passed in a kind of polished haze, the kind that makes pain feel strangely organized. Pastor Harris spoke about Arthur's patience, his reputation in town, the way he could fix almost anything with a wrench, a level, and 15 quiet minutes in the garage. People nodded. Some smiled through tears. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and watched strangers recognize the man I had loved, while the people closest to me quietly edited me out of him. The church bulletin rested against my knee, its paper already creased where my thumb had pressed too hard. I kept reading that one line, survived by his son, Mark Caldwell, and family, as if the words might change if I looked at them long enough. They did not. When Pastor Harris mentioned Arthur's early years in business, he said Mark had carried on his father's values. He did not say that I had balanced the books at our kitchen table after Mark went to bed. He did not say that I had answered customer calls while stirring soup, that I had driven invoices across town in winter when our old station wagon had no heat, that Arthur and I once counted quarters on the bedroom floor to make payroll by Friday. He did not know those things, perhaps, or perhaps someone had decided they were not needed. Vanessa sat 2 seats away from me, close enough to look respectful and far enough to avoid comfort. Every so often, she lifted a tissue to the corner of her eye, although I never saw a tear. Mark leaned toward her once, and she touched his wrist with a gentle little squeeze, the sort of gesture that told the room they were holding each other. Together. No one touched me. I could feel the empty inches on both sides of my body as if they had weight. Behind me, someone whispered, "Poor Mark. He has had to handle everything." Another voice answered, "Helen must not be doing well." I stared at the polished cross above the pulpit and let the words pass over me. Fragile. Not doing well. Needed rest. Those were Vanessa's words. I recognized them the way one recognizes a perfume that lingers after someone has left the room. For months, she had been saying them softly, carefully, always in front of the right people. Helen gets overwhelmed. Helen forgets details. Helen is taking Arthur's condition very hard. Each sentence sounded kind on its own. Together, they built a door and closed it between me and my own life. When the hymn began, everyone stood. I rose slowly, not because I was weak, but because grief makes the body move with ceremony. The black dress brushed against my knees. Arthur's handkerchief was still in my purse, folded into a square the way he liked it, with his initials stitched in blue thread. I had carried it because I thought I might need it for tears. Instead, I held it like evidence that he had existed beside me, not above me, not apart from me, but beside me. At the end of the pew, Emily turned around. She was 12, thin as a reed, with Mark's brown eyes before life had taught them to look away. She looked at me for 3 seconds too long, then glanced at the program in her hand. Her forehead tightened. Children notice what adults pretend not to see. Vanessa saw her looking and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her face forward. The movement was smooth. Practiced. I had watched Vanessa move people like that for years, never with force, always with timing. After the hymn, Pastor Harris invited Mark to speak. My son walked to the front and unfolded a page from his jacket pocket. His voice trembled at first, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to run across our backyard with grass stains on his jeans and ask his father to throw the baseball higher. Then his words settled into something prepared. He spoke of father and son fishing trips, of business lessons, of the legacy Arthur had left in him. He thanked Vanessa for being his rock. He thanked friends from the company. He thanked the church ladies for arranging food in the fellowship hall. He did not thank me. Not once. The omission landed quietly, but it landed everywhere. I felt heads shifting behind me, the small discomfort of people trying to understand a silence without naming it. Vanessa lowered her chin, as if the moment were solemn, but I saw her eyes move across the room. She was watching the effect. That was when I stopped wondering whether this had been an oversight. A mistake forgets. A plan observes. When Mark returned to his seat, he passed close enough for his sleeve to brush my shoulder. He did not look down. I wanted to reach for his hand. I wanted, for one foolish second, to ask him what I had done to deserve being treated like an old photograph turned toward the wall. But I had learned long ago that pleading with someone in public only gives them a larger stage. So I kept still. The service continued. The candles burned evenly. The lilies filled the air with sweetness so heavy it almost made me dizzy. And beneath all of it, beneath the prayers and polished shoes and folded programs, I felt the first clean edge of understanding. They were not grieving with me. They were positioning themselves around what came next. In the fellowship hall after the service, the room smelled of coffee, buttered rolls, and lilies carried in from the sanctuary. Long folding tables had been covered with white paper cloths, and the women from the church had arranged casseroles and silver pans along the back wall. People moved slowly, balancing paper plates and small cups, speaking in the gentle voices people use when they do not know what else to offer. I stood near the doorway with my purse held in both hands, feeling less like Arthur's widow than a guest who had arrived without an invitation. Every conversation seemed to close just before I reached it. A neighbor from 2 streets over touched my elbow and said, "Helen, I am so sorry." But before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside us with that warm, careful smile of hers. "She is very tired," Vanessa said softly, as if I were not standing right there. "It has all been a lot for her." The neighbor's eyes shifted from my face to Vanessa's, then softened with pity. I knew that look. It was the look people give a woman they believe has already slipped partly out of her own life. I wanted to say, I planned Arthur's medication chart. I sat through every doctor appointment. I know exactly which drawer holds his reading glasses and which sweater he wanted donated to the Veterans Center. But the words stayed behind my teeth. Vanessa guided the neighbor away with one hand on her back, already explaining that Mark had been so strong, that the company depended on him now, that Arthur had trusted him with everything. I looked across the room at my son. Mark was standing beside the memorial table, accepting condolences like a man receiving formal recognition. On that table sat the same 3 photographs from the program. Arthur with Mark and Vanessa. Arthur holding Emily when she was a baby, though I had been the one taking the picture. There was still no photograph of me. Not one. I had brought a small framed wedding portrait that morning, wrapped in a towel inside my tote bag. But Vanessa had stopped me in the church vestibule before the service. "We already have the display handled," she had said, smiling as if she had saved me trouble. "You should not have to worry about little details today." Little details. 44 years could become a little detail in the right mouth. I set my cup of coffee down untouched and walked toward the memorial table. Emily was there, tracing the edge of one frame with her finger. "Grandma," she whispered, "where's the picture of you and Grandpa in front of the old store?" My throat tightened. I knew the one she meant. Arthur and I standing outside Caldwell Home Supply in 1986, him in a brown jacket, me in a blue skirt, both of us smiling like 2 tired people who had just survived a storm and mistaken it for sunshine. "I brought it," I said. It did not make it to the table. Emily looked over her shoulder at her mother. Vanessa was watching us from across the room. Not directly. Never directly. Just enough. A few minutes later, Pastor Harris approached me, holding his coffee in both hands. His face carried the uneasy kindness of a man who knew he had stepped where he should not have. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I hope the service brought you some comfort." Mrs. Caldwell. At least he still remembered that. "It was a lovely service for Arthur," I said, though it seemed to be missing part of his life. His ears reddened. He lowered his voice. "Mark told me you preferred not to be mentioned. He said speaking about your marriage might be too painful for you." There it was. Not a mistake. Not an assumption. A statement placed in another man's mouth and carried to the pulpit like truth. I looked toward Mark, who was laughing softly at something one of Arthur's business friends had said. Vanessa stood beside him, accepting praise for her strength, her organization, her devotion to family. The room tilted in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Pastor," I said carefully, "I never asked to be left out." He closed his eyes for half a second, and that was all the confirmation I needed. Behind me, Vanessa's voice floated through the room, sweet and clear. Helen and Arthur had their own arrangement near the end. Mark just wanted today to reflect the people Arthur leaned on most. I turned. Several faces had gone still. Vanessa held her paper cup near her chest, her expression calm, almost sorrowful. She had said it beautifully, not cruelly, not loudly, beautifully enough to suggest I had failed my husband without giving me anything solid to hold up and deny. Mark looked at me then, finally, and his eyes were not confused. They were guarded. That hurt worse. A confused son can be reached. A guarded son has already chosen a side. I walked to the coat rack, opened my tote bag, and touched the towel wrapped around my wedding portrait. For a moment, I thought about pulling it out and placing it on the table myself. Then I stopped. A photograph would only start an argument they were prepared to make me lose. I had spent too many years smoothing tablecloths, softening voices, stepping aside so no one would feel uncomfortable. Today, I saw clearly what politeness had cost me. Vanessa had not removed my name with one whisper at the church. She had been teaching everyone how to forget me for months, maybe years. I picked up my coat, slipped Arthur's handkerchief deeper into my purse, and looked once more at the room full of people eating food under his name while mine hovered like a secret. I did not confront her. Not there. Not yet. Some truths deserve a better room. When I stepped outside the church, the January air felt sharp enough to wake me from whatever spell I had been sitting under. Fairview was quiet that afternoon, with snow piled along the curbs in gray ridges and bare maple branches tapping against the church windows behind me. People drifted toward their cars in dark coats, leaning into one another, carrying foil-covered plates, and murmured condolences. I stood near the sidewalk with my tote bag against my hip and watched Mark open the passenger door of his sedan for Vanessa. He used to do that for me when I visited them, back before Vanessa began saying I was old-fashioned and Mark began pretending he had not heard her. Emily waved at me from the back seat. I lifted my hand. Vanessa turned and said something to her, and the child slowly lowered her fingers. That small movement followed me all the way home. The house on Hawthorne Lane looked exactly as Arthur and I had left it, except for the black wreath Mark had hung on the front door without asking me. I stood on the porch for a long moment before going inside. Arthur's boots were still beside the mat, one leaning against the other, as if he had just stepped out to check the mailbox. His brown cardigan hung over the back of the kitchen chair. On the counter sat the yellow mug he had used every morning for 15 years, the one with a tiny chip near the handle. I had washed it the night before the hospital called and set it there to dry. Now it looked like a question no one could answer. I took off my coat, laid it carefully over the banister, and carried my tote bag into the dining room. The room was dim, the late afternoon light coming through the curtains in thin gray lines. This was where Arthur and I had paid bills, wrapped birthday gifts, signed school forms, argued over paint colors, and eaten grilled cheese sandwiches at midnight after Mark's high school football games. This room had known our life better than any church program ever could. I unwrapped the wedding portrait from the towel and placed it in the center of the table. There we were, Arthur and me, both 25, standing on the courthouse steps in Columbus with my veil caught slightly crooked in the wind. He had one arm around my waist and the other hand gripping a bouquet of daisies because roses had been too expensive that week. We had laughed about that for decades. Daisies last longer in memory, he used to say. I sat down and looked at the photograph until my eyes blurred. Not with tears exactly, with recognition. A life can be stolen in pieces before you ever notice the door is open. I began seeing it then, all the little moments I had explained away because peace seemed easier than suspicion. The first time Vanessa offered to help Arthur organize his medical appointments, then quietly removed my email from the hospital updates. The afternoon she told Mark I was too emotional to discuss business matters, even though I had helped build Caldwell Home Supply before she knew our last name. The Thanksgiving when she seated me near the kitchen doorway while her parents sat beside Arthur at the head of my own table. "You will be more comfortable here," she had said, touching my shoulder lightly. I had smiled. I had thanked her. That was the part that shamed me now, not her cruelty, but how often I had made it easy for her by calling it kindness. I walked to the hallway cabinet and pulled out the old blue ledger from the bottom shelf. Arthur had kept every important paper in that cabinet, sorted with the kind of patience that made him impossible to surprise. Insurance forms, property records, business documents, warranty cards for appliances we had not owned in 20 years. I opened the ledger and found his handwriting in the margins, small and neat. "Helen knows where everything is. Ask Helen first." I touched those words with 2 fingers. Ask Helen first. In that empty house, after a funeral where my name had been treated like an inconvenience, Arthur's handwriting felt steadier than any arm around my shoulders. I turned another page and found a receipt from 1986, the year we leased our first storefront. My signature was beside his. Helen Marie Caldwell. Not an accessory. Not in family. A partner. The telephone rang at 6:15, startling the silence so sharply that I nearly dropped the ledger. Mark's name appeared on the caller identification. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Mom," he said, sounding tired in the way people sound when they expect comfort from the person they have wounded. Vanessa and I think we should come by tomorrow to talk about next steps. I looked at Arthur's handwriting. What next steps? There was a pause. Papers rustled on his end. Or perhaps he was covering the receiver. The house, Dad's things, the company. It is a lot for you to handle alone. Alone. The words sat between us like a verdict he had already signed. Your father has been gone 4 days, I said. My voice did not shake. That surprised me. I know, Mom, but we cannot put everything off. Vanessa thinks it would be healthier for you if we make a plan now. Of course Vanessa thought that. Vanessa always thought quickly when something valuable was unattended. I looked around the dining room, at the wedding portrait, the ledger, the chairs Arthur had refinished by hand one summer when money was tight. Tomorrow is fine, I said. Come at 10. Mark exhaled, relieved. He mistook my agreement for surrender. Good. We only want what is best. I closed the ledger gently. I am sure you do. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. Then I pulled a notebook from the drawer, wrote the date at the top of a clean page, and began listing everything that had happened since Arthur went into the hospital. Names, times, sentences, omissions. Vanessa had spent months turning me into a shadow. I was done helping her hold the light. At 9:45 the next morning, before Mark and Vanessa arrived, the doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen, setting 3 mugs on the counter because habit is a stubborn thing, even when the people coming to your house no longer deserve coffee. Through the small window beside the front door, I saw Marjorie Ellis standing on the porch in a charcoal wool coat, holding a covered dish with both hands. Marjorie had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years, the kind of woman who remembered not only birthdays, but the hard anniversaries people suffer through quietly. Her gray hair was tucked beneath a red knit hat, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. When I opened the door, she did not offer the usual phrases people had been placing at my feet like sympathy cards. She simply looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Helen, I saw what they did yesterday." Those words loosened something in my chest I had been holding too tightly. I stepped aside and let her in. She set the dish on the kitchen counter, removed her gloves, and glanced toward the dining room, where my notebook and Arthur's old ledger still sat open on the table. "I brought chicken and rice casserole," she said. "And before you tell me you are not hungry, you can put it in the refrigerator and pretend later." It was such an ordinary sentence that I almost smiled. Marjorie had worked for Robert Langford's law office for 22 years before retiring, and she had known Arthur long before Mark married Vanessa. She had seen our business grow, seen our family dinners, seen me carry 2 pumpkin pies into church suppers and Arthur follow behind with folding chairs. She knew the shape of our life before Vanessa learned how to rearrange it. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee cooling between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Snow tapped softly against the window above the sink. Finally, Marjorie reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Arthur would have been heartsick," she said. "Not because the service was imperfect. Funerals are always imperfect. But because they made you look like a footnote." I looked down at her hand. "Pastor Harris said Mark told him I did not want to be mentioned." Marjorie's mouth tightened. "That is not true." "No," I said. "It is not." She studied my face, then lowered her voice. "Helen, there is something I need to say carefully. Robert called me last week. Not about legal details," she added quickly. "He would never cross that line. But he was worried because Mark had been pushing to delay the reading of Arthur's will. He said Mark wanted time to organize family matters first." I let the word settle. Organize family matters. That sounded exactly like Vanessa wearing Mark's voice. "Arthur updated his documents last fall," Marjorie continued. "I do not know everything in them, but I know enough to tell you this. He did not leave you unprotected." My fingers went still around the mug. "What do you mean?" Marjorie opened her purse and removed a cream-colored envelope, worn slightly at the corners. My name was written across the front in Arthur's handwriting. Helen. No last name. No formality. Just Helen. "Robert asked me to make sure you knew this existed if things became difficult," she said. Arthur gave him instructions. He was afraid Mark might be influenced after he was gone. The kitchen seemed to narrow around that envelope. I did not touch it at first. Seeing Arthur's handwriting felt like hearing his chair move in the next room. "Influenced by Vanessa," I said. Marjorie did not answer right away, which was answer enough. He noticed more than he let on. I picked up the envelope carefully. The paper was thick, the kind Arthur used for important letters because he believed some words deserved weight. My hands did not tremble. That surprised me again. Did he know they would do this? Marjorie sighed. I think he knew they might try. Before I could open the envelope, the sound of a car door closing came from outside. Then another. Mark and Vanessa were early. Of course they were. People who want control often arrive before the room is ready. Marjorie looked toward the front window, then back at me. Do you want me to stay? I slid Arthur's letter into the drawer beside the table and closed it gently. Yes, I said, but not in here. She understood immediately. She took her coffee and moved to the small sitting room off the hallway, where voices from the kitchen could still be heard if the door remained open. I smoothed the front of my sweater, placed the notebook beneath the ledger, and walked to the door just as Mark knocked. Vanessa stood beside him in a cream coat, her smile already arranged into concern. Helen, she said, stepping forward as though she owned the threshold. We came a little early. We thought this might take some time. I looked at my son, then at my daughter-in-law, then at the black wreath still hanging on my door. For the first time since Arthur died, I did not feel like a woman waiting to be told what would happen next. I felt like a woman who had just found the first key. Mark stepped into the kitchen first, carrying a leather folder under one arm, and Vanessa followed with the careful expression of someone entering a room she had already redesigned in her mind. She glanced at the 3 mugs on the counter, then at the ledger on the dining room table, then back at me. Her eyes paused for only a second, but I saw it. She had not expected papers. She had expected tissues. Mom, Mark said, leaning down to kiss my cheek, though his lips barely touched skin. How are you holding up? It was a question shaped like concern and used like a key, meant to open me gently so he could walk through. I am awake, I said. Vanessa removed her gloves slowly. That is good. Rest is important, but clarity is important too. She always liked words that sounded helpful while moving someone else out of the way. I poured coffee because my hands needed something ordinary to do. Mark sat at the dining room table in Arthur's chair. Not the side chair. Not the chair near the window. Arthur's chair. Vanessa sat beside him and laid one hand on the leather folder as if blessing it. I took my seat across from them. I did not ask them to move. Not yet. We know this is soon, Mark began, opening the folder. But Dad left a lot behind, and I think the best thing is to make practical decisions before emotions get in the way. I looked at the blue ledger near my elbow. Emotions have a way of being inconvenient at funerals. His face tightened. Vanessa leaned in, softening her voice. Helen, no one wants to upset you. Yesterday was difficult for everyone. Was it? I asked. The question hung there. Mark shifted. About the service, he said. I know you might feel. There were things left unsaid. My name, for example. Vanessa lowered her eyes, almost beautifully. We were trying to protect you. Pastor Harris understood that mentioning the marriage too much might overwhelm you. Did I tell you that? Her fingers stilled on the folder. Not in those exact words. Did I tell Mark that? Mark looked toward the window. Mom, it was obvious you were not in a place to handle everything. I took a slow sip of coffee. It had gone lukewarm, but the bitterness steadied me. I handled your father's medication schedule, his insurance forms, his oxygen deliveries, his physical therapy appointments, and the hospice nurse's instructions. I handled the call from the hospital at 3:12 in the morning. But my own name was too much for me to handle. Neither of them answered. From the sitting room, I heard the faintest shift of Marjorie's cup on its saucer. Vanessa recovered first. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You are turning this into blame, and that is not healthy. There it was again. Healthy. Fragile. Overwhelmed. The little white gloves she used to move ugly things around. Mark opened the folder and pulled out a printed sheet. We made a preliminary list of things that need to be done. The house is too much for you alone. The stairs, the yard, the property taxes. Vanessa found a senior living community about 20 minutes away. It is very nice. There are activities, meals, transportation to appointments. He slid a brochure across the table. A smiling gray-haired couple stood on the front, holding coffee cups beside a fake fireplace. I did not touch it. And what happens to this house? I asked. Vanessa answered before Mark could. We would keep it in the family. That is what Arthur would have wanted. Would you live here? Mark cleared his throat. Eventually, maybe. It makes sense. Emily is getting older, and we need more space. The company also needs stability, and having me here would send the right message. The right message. I looked at Arthur's chair beneath him, at Vanessa's hand on the folder, at the brochure waiting for me like a quiet eviction notice dressed as kindness. You have thought this through. Vanessa smiled gently. Someone had to. I let that sentence show me its teeth. Then I reached for my notebook and opened it to the page I had started the night before. Dates, times, sentences, omissions. Mark frowned. What is that? Memory, I said. Written down before anyone calls it confusion. Vanessa's smile weakened. I turned one page slowly, letting the sound of paper fill the room. Yesterday, Pastor Harris told me he left my name out because you told him I requested it. I did not. The program named you, Mark, and family. It did not name me as Arthur's wife. The memorial table included 3 photographs and removed the wedding portrait I brought. At the reception, Vanessa told guests I had been too fragile to participate. This morning, you arrived with a brochure for a place I never asked to visit and a plan for a house you do not own. Mark's cheeks colored. Mom, that is not fair. No, I said quietly. It is accurate. Vanessa sat back, her eyes colder now beneath the concern. Helen, you are grieving. This kind of suspicion can happen when someone is under stress. I looked directly at her. Then you will not mind if Robert Langford joins our next conversation. The room changed. It was small, barely visible, but I saw Mark's hand pause over the folder and Vanessa's breath catch before she smoothed it away. Why would we need Dad's lawyer? Mark asked. Because your father had one, I said. And because I am done having conversations where everyone speaks for Arthur except Arthur. For the first time, Vanessa had nothing ready. Outside, a snowplow moved slowly down Hawthorne Lane, scraping the street clean inch by inch. Inside my dining room, the silence did the same thing. Mark left my house with the senior living brochure still on the dining room table and his folder held tighter than when he arrived. Vanessa followed him, but not before turning at the door with one last soft look, the kind meant to appear wounded. I hope you do not let grief make you suspicious of the people trying to help you, she said. I looked at her cream coat, her polished boots, her carefully lowered eyes, and I almost admired how gently she could place a blade inside. A sentence. I hope you do not mistake patience for permission, I answered. Her expression flickered, only for a heartbeat. Then she stepped outside, and Mark closed the door behind them without saying goodbye. The house settled after they left. Old houses do that. They sigh through floorboards, click through radiators, and remind you that silence is not always empty. Marjorie came out of the sitting room carrying her coffee cup, her face pale with contained anger. Helen, she said, that was not concern. That was a rehearsal. I nodded. She was right. Mark and Vanessa had not come to discuss my future. They had come to test how easily it could be taken. I picked up the brochure with 2 fingers and placed it in the notebook between the page about the funeral program and the page about Pastor Harris. Evidence did not have to be dramatic. Sometimes it had glossy paper and a smiling couple on the front. That afternoon, I called Robert Langford's office. His receptionist, Diane, knew my voice before I finished saying my name. Mrs. Caldwell, she said softly, Mr. Langford has been expecting your call. Those words made me sit down, not because they frightened me, but because they meant Arthur had seen further ahead than I had allowed myself to believe. Robert came on the line a minute later. His voice was deep, steady, and careful, the way it had been when he helped us incorporate Caldwell Home Supply 38 years earlier. Helen, he said, not Mrs. Caldwell, not ma'am, just Helen, as if I were still a person before I was a widow. I am sorry about Arthur. He was a good man. I thanked him, and for the first time that day, the words did not taste like ash. Then I told him about the service. I told him about Pastor Harris, the missing photographs, Vanessa's comments, the brochure, Mark sitting in Arthur's chair and speaking as if the house were already halfway his. Robert did not interrupt. Lawyers listen differently from friends. Friends gasp. Lawyers make space for facts to line themselves up. When I finished, he was quiet for several seconds. Arthur was worried about this, he said at last. I closed my eyes. About Mark? About influence, Robert said. He loved his son, but he was not blind. I looked toward the drawer where Arthur's unopened letter waited. Marjorie brought me an envelope. Good. Arthur wanted you to have it before the formal reading if they began pressuring you. They have. Then do not sign anything. Do not agree verbally to transfer, sell, move, resign, or appoint anyone to manage your affairs. Not Mark. Not Vanessa. Not anyone from the company. The firmness in his voice steadied me more than comfort would have. Does Mark have any claim to the house? I asked. Robert exhaled once, quietly. No. The house passed to you outside probate. Arthur made sure of that years ago. Your name is on the deed with right of survivorship. It is yours. I looked at the walls around me. At the doorway Arthur had widened after I complained about carrying laundry baskets through it. At the scratch on the baseboard from Mark's toy truck when he was 5. Mine. Not because I wanted ownership more than family, but because Arthur had known family could become a word people used while reaching for keys. And the company? I asked. More complicated, Robert said, but also protected. Arthur placed Mark's inheritance and voting rights under conditions. If there is evidence of coercion, public humiliation, or an attempt to displace you from your legal home or your role in Arthur's estate, those rights can be suspended pending review. I opened my notebook and wrote each phrase carefully. Coercion, public humiliation, displace, legal home, role in estate. The words were cold, but they had structure. After days of being wrapped in soft lies, structure felt like a railing on an icy porch. Robert continued. There is also a personal letter to be read at the family meeting. Arthur wrote it himself. He was very specific. My eyes moved again to the drawer. What does it say? That is yours to read first, Robert said. But I will tell you this. He did not forget you, Helen. Not for one line. After we ended the call, I sat at the kitchen table until the winter light began fading from the windows. Then I opened the drawer and took out Arthur's letter. The envelope made a small sound beneath my thumb. I thought of the funeral program. I thought of Mark's whisper to Pastor Harris. I thought of Vanessa telling a room full of people that Arthur had leaned on others more than me. Slowly, I broke the seal. Arthur's handwriting filled the first page, familiar and slightly slanted. My dear Helen, it began, if you are reading this sooner than I hoped, then someone has mistaken your grace for weakness. I pressed my palm flat against the paper, not to hold myself together, to hold the moment still. The first sentence of Arthur's letter made the kitchen disappear around me. I was no longer hearing the refrigerator hum, or the radiator click, or the faint sound of tires passing over wet pavement outside. I was hearing my husband in the careful rhythm of his handwriting, the way he used to speak when he wanted me to listen without interrupting. My dear Helen, if you are reading this sooner than I hoped, then someone has mistaken your grace for weakness. I read that line 3 times before I could move on. Arthur had always known how to name things I tried to soften. He wrote that he had watched the changes in our family with a heavy heart. He had noticed how Vanessa spoke for me in rooms where I was present, how Mark began calling decisions practical whenever those decisions moved me farther from the center of my own home. He wrote that illness had made him quiet, not unaware. That sentence stopped me for a long while. Illness had made him quiet, not unaware. I thought of all the evenings when Arthur sat in his recliner with a blanket over his knees while Vanessa filled the room with plans. Meal schedules, company updates, holiday arrangements, guest lists that somehow grew shorter around my name. I had believed Arthur was too tired to notice. He had noticed everything. I continued reading. He wrote about our first winter in the house on Hawthorne Lane, when the furnace failed and we slept in the living room under 3 quilts while Mark, still a baby, stayed warm between us. He wrote about the year I worked weekends at the library so we could keep the store open through a slow season. He wrote about the morning I signed the second business loan with a hand that shook under the table, then made pancakes afterward because Mark had a school field trip and needed a normal day. These were not grand memories, not the sort people put in funeral programs. They were the beams behind the walls, the things that held a life up. Then the letter changed. Arthur's words became firmer. He wrote that the house belonged to me, not as a favor, not as a consolation, but because we had built our life there together and because he wanted no one, under any circumstances, to pressure me out of it. He wrote that if Mark truly loved him, Mark would honor me first, not after the business, not after appearances, not after Vanessa's comfort, but first. I put the letter down and looked toward the front hallway where Mark had stood that morning with a folder and a plan. For years I had told myself my son was caught in the middle. Now I wondered whether the middle had simply been a convenient place to hide. The final page of the letter was addressed to Mark, though Arthur had left it with mine. Son, he wrote, grief does not give you permission to become small. Your mother stood beside me before there was a company, before there was a house, before there was anything for you to inherit. If anyone asks you to reduce her place in my life, know this, they are asking you to dishonor mine. I covered my mouth with my hand. Not because I was sobbing. I was not. The feeling was deeper than tears. It was the ache of being defended by someone who was no longer there to stand up in the room. Arthur had also included instructions. Robert Langford was to hold a family meeting at my house within the week. Pastor Harris was to be invited if the funeral had been altered or misrepresented. Marjorie could attend as my witness if I wished. Mark and Vanessa were not to receive control of Arthur's voting shares until after that meeting and after Robert confirmed there had been no pressure placed on me. Every sentence had been thought through. Arthur, quiet in his recliner, had been building a fence around me while I thought he was only resting. The next morning, I went to Robert Langford's office on Main Street. The sidewalks were salted, and the courthouse clock showed 10:20 when I arrived. Robert met me in the conference room with a folder already waiting. He had aged since I last saw him, but his eyes were clear behind his glasses. "Helen," he said, "before we discuss anything else, this is the deed." He slid the document toward me. My name was there beside Arthur's, and beneath it the legal language Robert had mentioned. Right of survivorship. Sole ownership upon death. I traced my name with my eyes only. Helen Marie Caldwell. Still there. Still legal. Still mine. Robert then showed me the estate provisions, each one dry and formal, but powerful in its dryness. Mark's inheritance was conditional. Any documented attempt to remove me from my home, misrepresent my role, isolate me from estate information, or publicly diminish my standing as Arthur's surviving spouse could delay or limit his control. Arthur was unusually specific, Robert said. He wanted dignity written into the documents. I almost smiled at that. Only Arthur would try to make dignity enforceable. We scheduled the family meeting for Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock in my dining room. Robert would attend. Marjorie would attend. Pastor Harris, after a difficult phone call, agreed to come as well. I did not call Mark immediately. I waited until I returned home, hung my coat in the hallway, and placed Arthur's letter beside the wedding portrait on the dining room table. Then I dialed my son. Vanessa answered his phone. "Helen," she said, with that smooth concern already in place. "Is everything all right?" I looked at Arthur's handwriting, at my name on the envelope, at the house around me holding steady in the winter light. "Everything is becoming very clear," I said. "Tell Mark to be here Sunday at 2. Robert Langford will explain the rest." For the first time since the funeral, Vanessa did not answer quickly. Sunday arrived with a pale sky and a stillness that made every sound in the house seem deliberate. I set the dining room table the way I always had for important family conversations. Water glasses, plain white napkins, a small plate of butter cookies from the bakery Arthur loved, and no coffee until everyone arrived. Hospitality was not surrender. It was discipline. At 1:50, Marjorie came through the back door with her notebook and sat near the sideboard. At 1:55, Robert Langford arrived in a dark overcoat, carrying a leather briefcase that looked almost as old as our marriage. Pastor Harris came last, his face drawn, his Bible tucked under one arm, though I suspected he knew this meeting would require more truth than scripture. Mark and Vanessa arrived at exactly 2, Emily between them in a navy winter coat. I had not expected them to bring her. Vanessa probably thought a child in the room would soften me. She had forgotten that children often hear what adults work hardest to hide. Mark looked tired. Vanessa looked prepared. She stepped into my dining room and glanced at Robert, then at the papers arranged before him, and for the first time I saw uncertainty move across her face without a smile covering it fast enough. "I thought this was just family," she said. Robert stood. "It is an estate meeting, Mrs. Caldwell. Accuracy matters." The words settled beautifully. Accuracy matters. Mark sat in Arthur's chair again, but this time I did not let it pass. "Mark," I said calmly, "please sit in the chair beside Vanessa. Your father's chair will remain empty today." His face flushed, but he moved. The chair stood vacant at the head of the table, and somehow Arthur felt more present there than he had in the church full of flowers. Robert began with the deed. His voice was even, professional, impossible to bend. He explained that the house on Hawthorne Lane passed fully to me upon Arthur's death. No vote. No discussion. No family plan. Mine. Mark stared at the table. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her purse strap. Then Robert explained the conditions attached to Mark's inheritance and company voting rights. Documented pressure. Misrepresentation. public humiliation, attempts to displace the surviving spouse. Each phrase landed without drama, which made it land harder. This is ridiculous, Vanessa said finally. We were trying to help Helen. Marjorie looked up from her notebook. By removing her name from her husband's funeral program? Vanessa turned sharply. That was not my decision. Pastor Harris cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, but the room heard every word. Mark told me Mrs. Caldwell preferred not to be mentioned. I now understand that was untrue. Mark closed his eyes. Emily looked at her father as if something inside her had just shifted shape. Vanessa leaned forward. People misunderstand things during grief. This is being twisted. I opened the folder in front of me and took out Arthur's letter. The room changed before I read a single word. Mark recognized his father's handwriting. So did Vanessa, though she tried not to. Before anyone explains what Arthur wanted, I said, Arthur will speak for himself. I read slowly. I read the line about my grace being mistaken for weakness. I read the memories he had chosen, not the grand ones, but the true ones. The failed furnace, the weekend job, the first business loan, the years of quiet work no funeral program had room for. Mark's face broke piece by piece, not loudly, not completely, but enough that I saw the boy he had been beneath the man Vanessa had learned to guide. Then I read the words Arthur had written to him. Your mother stood beside me before there was a company, before there was a house, before there was anything for you to inherit. If anyone asks you to reduce her place in my life, know this, they are asking you to dishonor mine. No one moved. Even the old radiator seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa whispered, that is not fair. I folded the letter and placed it beside the wedding portrait I had set at the center of the table. No, I said, what happened at the church was not fair. What happened in this house yesterday morning was not fair. What happened every time you called me fragile, so people would stop asking me questions was not fair. This is not unfair, Vanessa. This is documented. Robert slid a final page across the table. Until further review, Mark's voting rights in Caldwell Home Supply are suspended. Any attempt to pressure Mrs. Caldwell regarding her residence or estate role will be referred through my office. Mark looked at me then, truly looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. Mom, he said, his voice small. I had waited so long to hear softness from him that I almost reached for it. Almost. I loved your father, I said, and I loved the little boy you were. But I will not hand my dignity to the man you have become just because I remember him. Tears filled Emily's eyes. She stood, walked around the table, and placed both arms around my shoulders. I held her carefully, feeling the future and the past meet in that small embrace. Vanessa rose too quickly, her chair scraping the rug. Come on, Mark, she said. But Mark did not move right away. He stared at Arthur's empty chair. Perhaps he finally understood that a legacy is not the same as an inheritance. One is given by paper. The other is lost by conduct. After they left, the house did not feel empty. It felt returned. Pastor Harris apologized before he went, not with excuses, but with his head bowed and his voice plain. Robert gathered his papers. Marjorie squeezed my hand. When the door closed behind them, I stood alone in the dining room beside Arthur's chair and touched the wedding portrait with one finger. They had tried to leave my name out of his final farewell. Arthur had made sure it was written into everything that mattered.